Hello and welcome to Nocab Game Design. This is the first combat operation of Chapter 15, and I'll call it here. We're now officially in the late game. Now, the difference between early, mid, and late game is more instinct than hard and fast game design rule, but for me, I'd consider late game to be the part of the game that has all of the tools available to the player. All of the mechanics have been introduced, so now the developers can build levels with every tool in their box. And that's what's happening in this level, titled Fight for Gerlandio, or at least I think that's how it's pronounced. In this episode, I take a step back and take stock of all the game design elements present, cataloging and questioning and explaining all the design decisions the developers made, with the ultimate goal of learning something about game design. So, let's play. As I said in the intro, this first combat operation of Chapter 15 is jam-packed with mechanics and game content. Now, that being said, it's a medium-sized level, both in length and level architecture footprint. It took me between 6 to 10-ish turns to complete, with a total of about an hour to 90 minutes of gameplay. Sizable, but not exhausting. Now, when I replayed this level for this series, I was playing it quite safe. If you haven't watched the previous episode, I recommend you check it out, so you can understand my timidness. Link in the description. But in summary, the previous level was a trap that the player was forced to run into. In this level, the player is made to run headlong into an enemy fortress. The fortress itself is not a trap per se. It's clearly visible and not trying to trick the player into a false sense of security. In fact, the structure is quite impressive and imposing, studded with cannons and machine guns. Even just looking at the command view map of this level gives off a sense of danger. There's trenches, watchtowers, landmines, tank barricades, gates, enemy spawn camps, not to mention the enemies themselves. There's so much stuff in this level, the game is having a hard time keeping up the frame rate. In a previous episode, I touched on the idea that a game is an authored experience, and that by using some design techniques, the developers can enhance that experience. Link in the top right to that video. I won't go through all those techniques in detail here, but suffice it to say that in this level, the developers are following those principles again. The experience or emotion they want the player to feel is some kind of grim determination. The player controls only a few units from a small local militia, Squad 7, but this fortress, these tanks, these troops and machine guns, the level itself is perhaps the most formidable defense the player has ever been told to attack. Now, the player has been up against tough odds before, but in those levels, the enemy elements would be hidden from the player. Something would always block line of sight, like buildings, cliffs, or sneak attacks that just spawn in new units partway through. Not here. It's clear to see from turn 1 that the player is outnumbered and outgunned, but not outsmarted, so there's still hope. This forced perspective of constantly showing the player how bad the situation seems really drives home the emotional impact of the level. Just moving around some non-interactive assets like walls or hallways, a good game designer can encourage a certain game feel. Remember, the level architecture is the bones of the game. Everything else is built off of it. This level is an authored experience, and a highly polished one at that. The developers had a vision of how they wanted the player to feel, and they laid it on thick. Good design. This level is also a clear example of encounter theory. In fact, it's an even better example than the level I used to define the theory. But to explain it, I need to first come clean. I lied earlier. I said that in this level, the player has to attack the fortress, but that's not technically true. The player just has to turn on these 3 railcar switches, so the galleons can send an explosive train into the fort. Each railcar switch is heavily guarded, but more importantly, each switch is clearly boxed off in its own combat encounter area. Let's look at these one at a time. The first one is near the start of the level and next to an enemy camp. The camp is defended by machine guns and a tank, but it's also got some side paths for the player to explore and get a flanking position. Okay, maybe this one is not heavily defended, but it's still a handcrafted encounter. There's content for the player to engage with grouped in a specific area. Even the surrounding architecture is enhancing the gameplay by providing alternative routes and the opportunity for complex planning. And this is good design. Keeping the first encounter relatively simple makes a lot of sense. The developers don't dump the player into the extreme complexity that is the other two encounters, but start the player off on an easier problem to warm up on. Then, after the player gets comfortable, the complexity scales quite quickly. This is good complexity design, especially for level-based games. Maybe your players only have time to play on the weekends, or maybe they're picking the game up after a break. If they get thrown right into level 15, it might be too overwhelming and they'll put the game down for good. But I digress. The first encounter is clearly centered around the rail signal, the first goal for the player to achieve. The second rail switch is indisputably heavily guarded. 2 tanks point towards the middle line. One is a named elite tank unit, very powerful. More landmines than I've ever seen clog up the ground, and there's no cover for an incoming attacker. There are some trenches, but these are also full of shock troopers and are placed behind the rail signal goal. The key element here is that this entire combat area is blocked off from the first and last encounter. There is a physical wall separating the 3 encounters, and there are dedicated troops present here that will not move a finger to defend the first rail switch. This is clearly a modular, isolated encounter authored by the developers. Now, because of this modular level design, it seems like it could be easy enough for a player to simply go around the middle encounter straight for the end. And perhaps that is possible, and maybe that's why they added the rail signals to this level. Sometimes encounters offer intrinsic allure to a player. You see this a lot in open world games. The encounter is the exploration, or the fighting, or whatever the players are actively looking for and drawn towards. But this is not an open world game. It's a strategy tactics puzzle game. The players are trying to solve the level as effectively as they can. In other words, the players are trying to actively avoid interacting with the game content. So in order to get a player to engage with the encounter, a designer will sometimes have to take drastic measures, and that's what we can see here. Perhaps the oldest tool in the game maker's toolbox: put a win condition in it.
Great, that's 2 switches, just 1 left to go.
The player cannot win unless they hit all 3 of these rail signals. The player must engage with the encounter. And finally, on the other side of the gate is the last rail switch, but you do have to go around and engage with the more complicated encounter. Again, defended by troops and tanks, but this one has machine gun turrets, and they hurt a lot. There's no cover, except maybe a friendly tank, but at a certain point, you're going to have to run out of cover and into hellfire. A last act of desperation, which does a good job of hammering home the authored experience of grim determination and desperation. This level does a good job of demonstrating intra-level plot progression. Now, the prefix intra means within, whereas inter means between. So intra-level is something that is happening within a level, whereas inter-level is something that's happening between or across levels. I'll repeat, this level does a good job demonstrating intra-level plot progression. Okay, maybe not quite plot progression in the traditional sense, but it does a good job of building the emotional impact of the battle. The player becomes the author and decides exactly how the drama unfolds, which characters are going to be involved, and what conflict arises, but the developers hold an authorship role too. The developers foster the intra-level plot progression by creating a series of encounters with rising action. I've talked previously about flow theory, how the challenge of the game should grow with the player's skill, but this level takes it a step further, not only presenting a series of increasingly challenging encounters, but also encounters that increase the dramatic tension and advance the emotional impact of the plot. Without even knowing the total number of levels in this game, I think a new player can tell that the climax is approaching. This is amazing game design, and the specific design goal here seems to be exciting storytelling. Storming an enemy fortress, dispatching the forward scouts, pushing through the trenches and landmines, dodging machine guns and incoming cannon fire, getting pinned down and trying to rescue a teammate, making decisions on who lives and who dies. This would be a very exciting action sequence in a movie. This is why I picked the Valkyria Chronicles as the second game to review in the Masterpiece series. I've played a lot of games, and there are a lot of games out there that tell a good story, but there are also a lot of games that are just a graphic novel or a movie with some gameplay sprinkled in. The developers of the Valkyria Chronicles clearly have a good story to tell, but lean into games themselves as a medium for storytelling. This level, this battle, is the rising action plot progression. Sure, there are a lot of cutscenes in this game too, but the levels themselves are part of the story. This is why Valkyria Chronicles is a masterpiece, because it authors experiences for the player that are so rich, so fleshed out, and so well tied into the larger plot that it really feels like the player is co-authoring the game. Good design.
Yes, we've hit all 3 of the switches.
And thanks for watching. Perhaps I got a little too academic at the end there, but what can I say? It's hard not to get excited when talking about a masterpiece game. What games have you played that you felt like a co-author? A game that told such a good story and one that really pulled you in and made you feel like you were right there in the world? Let me know in the comments. And yes, this is partly a plug to drive interaction and boost my algorithm rating. But also, this kind of reflection is really important if you want to get better at game design. Really think, what games have you played that you truly got lost in? What about them caused that to happen? What ingredients can be added to your games to make them better? And the first step to all that is posting a comment on this video. Plus, I should really start thinking of the next game to review. The end is near, so I need some ideas. Any suggestions? In the next video, Squad 7 does battle with Sylvaria again. I'll see you there.
One of us is going to die here. Now, we fight!